So now we want to talk about the building blocks of the Keynesian model, which provides us the tools for conducting the Keynesian type of analysis. So to begin with, we want to review what we learned about the labor markets, the goods market, and money market equilibrium based on the classical view. So begin with, for the labor market, we say that when we want to look at the labor market equilibrium, we will need to look at the labor demand and the labor supply. And then the labor demand is a function of the price of the labor market, which is the wages, and then the quantity of labor demanded will be affected by the firm's productivity as well as the size of the capital input they want to put into the production process. For the labor supply, it is also a function of the wages, which is the price of the labor market. The quantity of the labor supplied will be affected by the wealth of the individual, people's expectation about the future wages, and also the size of the population. When the wealth is lower or when the future wages is higher, if we expect that, then it will both causes a fall in the current labor supply. If the population size increases, then it will causes an increase in the quantity of labor supplied, holding all the other things being equal. So these are the factors that we look at when we are looking at the labor market equilibrium. For the goods market, the equilibrium we look at is also the supply and demand of the goods. And the supply of the goods in the labor market is the savings, and the demand for the goods in the goods market is the investment. The price of the goods market is the real interest rate. Therefore, the saving is the function of the real interest rate. And other than that, the changes in the current income, future income, wealth, and expected returns will all affect the size of the savings. On the other hand, for investment, it will for sure affected by the R, which is the price for the goods market. Other than that, the tax rate or the factor that affecting the marginal product of the capital will affect how much the firms want to invest. Therefore, all these factors will affect the goods market equilibrium. Finally, for the asset market, we already mentioned that when we are wanting to look at the asset market, we can separate the asset into the monetary assets and the non-monetary assets. For the money market in equilibrium, and as long as the asset market is in equilibrium, then the non-monetary asset market will restore the equilibrium for sure. Therefore, when we want to look at the asset market, we can just solely look at the money market. Once it is in equilibrium, then the asset market is also in equilibrium. Therefore, in here, we look at the money market equilibrium to illustrate the concept of the asset market equilibrium. So then for money market, the supply is controlled by the central bank. The money demand is the function of the income and also the return of the non-monetary assets. And this equation tells us that the real money demand will be affected by the income, also the return of the non-monetary assets. So when we want to derive the building blocks for the Keynesian analysis, we want to look at also the equilibrium of all the markets. But under the analysis, we want to draw a graph that captures the relationship between the real interest rate and the output size for all the markets. That is, we want to look at when the labor market, goods market, and asset market is in equilibrium, what should be the relationship between the real interest rate and the output. Therefore, we say that for the labor market, we are going to use the full employment line to represent the labor market equilibrium. Under the Keynesian model, we are going to use the S-curve to represent the goods market equilibrium. And then for the money market, we are going to use the LM curve to represent the money market equilibrium, and thus also the asset market equilibrium. So then what we want to do next is that we want to talk about each line in detail about how to derive those lines. So to begin with, when we want to look at the labor market equilibrium, and we want to come up with the building blocks for the Keynesian analysis, we need to draw the labor market equilibrium in a graph that the vertical axis is R and the horizontal axis is Y. The R is the real interest rate, the Y is the output. So then we want to ask, well, the labor market equilibrium has something to do with the R. Remember, R is the real interest rate. It is the price for the goods market, but it is not the price for the labor market. Therefore, we know that when we want to come up with the labor market equilibrium diagram, and then we want to come up with the relationship between R and Y, we know the labor market equilibrium has nothing to do with the R. What we know is that from the classical view, the labor market equilibrium is determined by the labor supply and the labor demand. And then we are going to have a quantity that equating the labor supply and the labor demand. And therefore, we know that when the labor market is in equilibrium, there will exist a level that is called the full employment. Why we define the full employment is because we know the economy will for sure exist some certain level of the unemployment. As we mentioned earlier, that particular unemployment that exists anyhow is the frictional unemployment and the structural unemployment. And the full employment that we are talking about is that when the economy's unemployment rate equal to the natural rate of unemployment, then we call it full employment. So in here, when we want to picture the labor market equilibrium and identify what's the relationship between the real interest rate and output when the labor market is in equilibrium, we know that as long as the labor market is in equilibrium, the economy is at full employment, its output is also at the full employment output level, but then it has nothing to do with the real interest rate. Therefore, it is a vertical line, and then the point where it crosses the horizontal axis is the full employment output level. Once the labor market is in equilibrium, then the economy will be at the full employment level, and then the corresponding output will be the full employment output. And then it has nothing to do with the R, which means that it can correspond to any level of the R. So then the full employment line is a vertical line. So what we can get from here is that on top of the full employment line, each point represents a labor market equilibrium. Therefore, there are multiple labor market equilibrium in this graph. There is not only one labor market equilibrium. In contrast to the classical view, we say that when we draw the labor market equilibrium diagram, there is only one labor market equilibrium in the graph because it is the crossing point of the labor supply curve and the labor demand curve. But under the Keynesian diagram for the labor market equilibrium, the full employment line, in fact, each point on top of it represents a labor market equilibrium. So that is the main difference between the building blocks of the Keynesian analysis versus the classical analysis. So then what could be the factor that's shifting the full employment line to the right? Well, whatever factor that causes the full employment output to increase, then it will cause the full employment line to shift to the right. Therefore, in here we conclude that when there is a positive productivity shock or when there is an increase in the capital input, then all of them will cause an increase in the full employment output given the same level of the labor input. Other than that, when there is an increase in the quantity of labor supply, given there is the same level of the productivity or capital, the full employment output will also increase. Therefore, all these factors will cause the full employment line to shift to the right. Now let's take a look at the building blocks for the goods market equilibrium under the Keynesian analysis. Again, we also want to draw the goods market equilibrium in a diagram with the vertical axis is R and the horizontal axis is Y. It turned out that if we recall what we learned for the goods market equilibrium, we said that the goods market equilibrium is equating of the savings and investment. And then the saving curve slopes upward and the investment curve slopes downward. And then the real interest rate equating the savings and investment will be the equilibrium for this market. So then when we want to come up with the relationship between R and Y for goods market equilibrium, we know that if we changes the Y, we want to see how does the real interest rate got changed. Then we will be able to get the relationship between R and Y. So then from the saving and investment diagram, we know that when the income is higher, then people will prefer to save more, which will shift the saving curve to the right. Then because of that, the economy will end up to have a lower real interest rate in equilibrium. In other words, based on this relationship, we know that when the output is higher, the real interest rate is lower. There exists a negative relationship between R and Y when the goods market is in equilibrium. Again, we know that on top of this IS curve, they have multiple equilibrium on this curve because each point of the IS curve tells us what should be the R and Y for one goods market is in equilibrium. Therefore, similar to our discussion related to the full employment line, every point on the IS curve represents a goods market equilibrium. And it is different from the classical view because under the classical view in the saving and investment diagram, there is only one equilibrium in the graph. So then from this graph, we know that when there is whatever factor that causes the left shift of the saving curve or whatever factor that causes the right shift of the investment curve, both of them will cause the real interest rate to increase. In other words, the factor that will shift the IS curve to the right will be any factor that causes an increase in R under the equilibrium except the changes in the Y. And then all of them will cause the right shifts of the IS curve. That is because when we draw the IS curve, we know that when we are given the same level of the Y, whatever factor that causes the shifts of the saving curve or investment curve except Y, which causes an increase in the R, tell us that the R should be higher, and then the corresponding IS curve need to be higher. Therefore, it will cause the right shift of the IS curve. So then how about for the asset market equilibrium? Again, when we want to come up with the asset market equilibrium, we want to come up with the asset market equilibrium and we want to identify what is the relationship between R and Y when the asset market is equilibrium. So again, what we need to do is that we need to look at the money market equilibrium because we know once the money market is in equilibrium, then the asset market will also be in equilibrium. And then we want to come up with the relationship between the Y and R when the money market is in equilibrium, then we will be able to draw the LM curve. It turned out that when the Y is higher, then people will demand more money in real terms, and that is what we learned before. And then so we know that before the changes in the Y, we are going to have the R in this level. Then when the income gets higher, people is going to demand more money. Therefore, given the same level of the R, we are going to have more money demand. So it will shift the curve to the right. And then in equilibrium, we are going to have the R, which is higher. Therefore, in conclusion, we know that based on this diagram, there exists a positive relationship between the real interest rate and the output when the asset market is in equilibrium. Therefore, we can draw the asset market equilibrium that is a line sloping upward, and we call it the LM curve. So similar to our previous discussion, we say that every point on top of the LM curve represents an asset market equilibrium. And the factor that will shift the LM curve to the right will be the factor that causes the decrease in the R under the equilibrium of the money demand and the money supply in real terms, except the changes in the Y. And all of them will cause the right shifts of the LM curve. And that is because if we look at the LM curve, we know that whatever factor that causes the changes in the R except changes in the Y, then it tells us that we are given a level of a Y, and then somehow something happened and causes the R to decrease from one level to the other. So then we will be able to come up with a new LM curve which is at a lower position than the previous one. Therefore, in here we show that whatever factor that causes a decrease in R under the money market equilibrium will cause the right shifts of the LM curve. So in conclusion, we talk about the building blocks of the Keynesian type of analysis, and we start from reviewing the classical view about the equilibrium, and then we move toward to the Keynesian view about equilibrium. So then we review what is the labor market equilibrium, goods market equilibrium, and asset market equilibrium under the classical view. And then based on what we already learned before, we start to develop the building blocks of the Keynesian view. And the main key components of the building blocks of the Keynesian view type of analysis is that we want to draw the equilibrium on a diagram that the vertical axis is R and the horizontal axis is Y. And this relationship is different from the classical view. For all the diagrams under the classical view, when we want to draw the labor market equilibrium, the goods market equilibrium, and the asset market equilibrium, we are always drawing a graph with the vertical axis is the price and the horizontal axis is the quantity. In here, for the Keynesian type of analysis, our building blocks for describing the goods market equilibrium, labor market equilibrium, and the asset market equilibrium is that we want to identify what is the relationship between the real interest rate and output for all the markets equilibrium. And we already show that for describing the labor market equilibrium, it is a vertical line and we call it a full employment line. For the IS curve, which characterizes the goods market equilibrium, it is a curve that is sloping downward because there exists a negative relationship between R and Y when the goods market is equilibrium. Finally, when we are drawing the asset market equilibrium, it is a curve that is sloping upward because we know when the asset market is in equilibrium, there exists a positive relationship between the real interest rate and the output. And this concludes our discussion related to the building blocks of the Keynesian type of analysis. And this is the end of today's lecture.